The rain came in sideways that Thursday evening, the kind of October rain that doesn't fall so much as lean, cold, and relentless and indifferent to whatever plans you might have made. Leaves the color of old pennies plastered themselves against the pavement outside Maple Street Market, and the neon sign above the entrance buzzed and flickered like it had been doing since the previous winter, and nobody had gotten around to fixing it yet. Ethan Carter crossed the parking lot with his collar turned up and his shoulders hunched and his mind doing the arithmetic it always did in the produce aisle. Not the kind of arithmetic that ends in abundance, but the kind that ends in choices. Milk or orange juice, generic brand or nothing at all. Whether the copay for Lily's follow-up appointment next Tuesday would clear before the landlord's auto draft tried to pull the rent on the 15th. He was 34 years old. He was tired in the specific way that single fathers get tired, not sleepy, exactly, but worn thin at the edges, like a coat that's been through too many winters. He pushed through the sliding glass doors and grabbed a basket and told himself 20 minutes, in and out, just the essentials. He had absolutely no idea that the next 3 minutes would split his life cleanly in two. Portland in autumn had a particular smell to it. Coffee and wet concrete and wood smoke from the neighborhoods up toward the hills, where the houses had fireplaces and the yards had real trees, not just the scraggly ornamental pears the city planted along the commercial strips. Ethan had grown up in one of those neighborhoods. He no longer lived there. He lived now in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building on Clemens Avenue, a building whose elevator worked roughly 60% of the time, and whose walls were thin enough that he could track the sleep schedules of the couple next door without particularly trying. The apartment was clean. He kept it clean on principle, his mother's voice, still present after 15 years, insisting that dignity doesn't require money, only effort. The apartment was small. That was simply the math of what he could afford on a warehouse associate's salary at Bennett Holdings. The job was third shift, 11 at night to 7 in the morning, which meant that on school days he was home by 7:30, made breakfast, walked Lily to the bus stop, came back and slept until 2 in the afternoon, did laundry or errands or whatever Lily's school had sent home in her backpack, and then was back at the bus stop at 3:15 when she returned. Then dinner, then homework, then whatever story she was currently obsessed with. She'd been on a long run of mythology, gods and monsters, and the kind of quests where nobody really wins. Then Lily to bed. Then Ethan to the warehouse by 10:45. He'd been doing this for 3 years. Since Christine left, he didn't spend much time thinking about Christine anymore, or rather, he'd gotten good at not thinking about her the way you get good at not touching a bruise. She was in Seattle now. She called Lily on birthdays and sometimes on holidays, and Lily had stopped asking why she didn't visit. That particular silence in his daughter's life was the thing that cost Ethan the most, the thing he couldn't fix with extra pancakes on Saturday morning or a longer bedtime story or a day trip to the coast when he'd managed to save enough. What he could fix, what he was always trying to fix, was the financial architecture of their life, which had the structural integrity of a house of cards in a room with the windows open. The rent was $1,400 a month. The warehouse paid him $19.50 before taxes. Lily had asthma, mild, managed, but the inhalers weren't cheap, and the quarterly appointments with the pediatric pulmonologist at OHSU were not entirely covered by the benefits package that Bennett Holdings offered its hourly workers. He was 3 weeks behind on the electric. He had $412 in checking and a credit card that was $300 from its limit. He needed the job to last. That was the arithmetic. That was the prayer he didn't quite know how to pray, because the word circulating in the break room passed in the careful, half-whispered tones of people who don't want to seem like they know more than they do, was that Bennett Holdings was restructuring, that the third quarter numbers had missed, that the executive floor was in meetings all day, every day, and nobody was coming down to say anything reassuring. Ethan had been picking up extra shifts when he could. He had a second application out to a logistics company across town. He was being careful and methodical and trying very hard not to let any of this show, When Lily looked at him across the dinner table, because she was 8 years old and perceptive in the way that children of single parents often become attuned to the frequencies of adult worry, reading faces the way other children read picture books. So that Thursday evening, when he finally got through the warehouse doors at 7:05 and drove to Maple Street Market, because Lily had woken up with a scratchy throat, and they were out of the children's decongestant she liked, and he needed milk and bread anyway. He was running on 5 hours of sleep and a to-go cup of coffee he'd finished an hour ago, and the persistent background hum of financial anxiety that had become, at this point, simply the baseline condition of his existence. He pulled a basket. He found the decongestant in aisle 7. He got the store-brand milk and the whole-grain bread, and he was heading for the checkout when he heard, from the direction of Register 3, a voice he did not expect to hear in a supermarket at 7:30 on a rainy Thursday evening. He stopped. He looked. He told himself, immediately, that he was wrong. That it couldn't be her. He was not wrong. Sophia Bennett was not supposed to be at Maple Street Market. This was not a thought Ethan had articulated. It was simply the cognitive dissonance of seeing someone entirely out of context, like finding a page from an art museum catalog tucked inside a grocery store circular. Sophia Bennett existed in internal company emails and in the framed photograph on the lobby wall of Bennett Holdings' downtown office, the one where she stood in front of a glass wall with Portland's skyline behind. Her, wearing a charcoal blazer, her expression composed and calibrated and entirely in command. She was 31. The youngest CEO in the company's history, which was the kind of fact that got mentioned in press profiles and business publications. She did not, in Ethan's imagination, buy groceries, but there she was, standing near the candy display at Register 3, wearing dark jeans and a cream-colored coat that was clearly expensive, her dark hair slightly damp from the rain. She was not looking at her phone. She was not looking at the candy. She was looking at a man tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a way that read less as style and more as armor, who was standing close to her. Too close. The spatial geometry of the scene was wrong in the way a conversation can look wrong even from across a store, even when you can't hear a word. Ethan heard the next part, though, because the man's voice carried the particular quality of someone who has never had to modulate his volume in deference to other people. You think you can keep this up without a support system? Without someone in your corner? The board sees a woman who goes home to an empty apartment, Sophia. They see instability. Sophia's jaw was set. Her hands were loose at her sides, consciously loose, Ethan thought. The deliberate stillness of someone controlling a response. Daniel, this isn't the place. It's exactly the place. You've been avoiding my calls for 2 weeks. You want to run that company? You need allies. You need to stop pretending you don't. Ethan knew the name. Daniel Vaughn, former husband, significant shareholder. His name appeared in the company-wide emails in the way that certain names appear in legal documents, always present, always slightly threatening, the shadow behind the official language. He watched Daniel lean in, voice dropping to something that wasn't quite a whisper, the practiced intimate register of someone who has learned that lowering his voice makes other people lean closer, makes them complicit in the conversation they didn't choose to have. There's a board meeting in 3 weeks. I'm going to table a motion about your fitness for the role. I'll be talking to Marcus and to Rennick before then. You can make this very clean, or you can make it very ugly. That's not a threat. It's arithmetic. Sophia said nothing. Something crossed her face, not fear, exactly, but the recognition of a corner she'd been backed into, the assessment of distances and angles. And then she looked up. Across the candy displays and the idle checkout lane and the wet handprints on the linoleum floor, directly at Ethan Carter, he saw her register him. He saw her look away, look back. He saw something shift in her expression, something calculating, desperate, and committed, all at once, in the space of a single second. She walked toward him. He didn't move. He wasn't sure he could. She reached him and she took his hand, not tentatively, but with a grip that was warm and firm and completely certain, and she turned back toward Daniel and said, in a voice that rang across the checkout lanes like a bell, "Daniel, meet Ethan, my boyfriend." And then she turned her face up to his, and she was close enough that he could see the calculation in her green eyes, alongside something else, something raw and tired, and quietly asking. And she said it so quietly that only he could hear it. "Please, just for a minute. Go along with it. 3 seconds." That was what he had. Ethan was not a man who made decisions impulsively. He was the kind of person who read the entire lease before signing, who kept a spreadsheet for his monthly expenses, who thought about consequences the way some people think about weather constantly, with a watchful eye on the horizon. He had not made an impulsive decision of any significance since he was 22 years old, and the consequences of that one had rearranged his life so completely that caution had become not just a habit, but a creed. In the first second, he processed the variables. She was his employer. He was her employee. The power differential was total and absolute. She had just asked him to lie to a man who, by the sound of it, was planning to dismantle her career. If he played along and it went wrong, the fallout would land on him as well as on her. If he refused, she would be left standing in a supermarket checkout lane with her hand in empty air, and Daniel Vaughn would know exactly how isolated she was, and he would use it. In the second, he thought about Lily, not in a calculating way, not the way a man thinks about leverage. He thought about her the way he always thought about her, as the fixed point around which everything else orbited. If he lost this job, he would find another one. He believed that in the abstract, but in the specific, the inhalers, the rent, the copay, the $412 that had to last until the 15th in the specific, the margin for error was 0. In the third second, he looked at Sophia Bennett's face. He'd seen that face before, not hers specifically, but that expression, the one that lives behind the composed exterior of a person who has been managing alone for a very long time and has just run out of road. He knew that expression, the way you know it when you've worn it yourself in the mirror at 6 in the morning after a night shift, trying to figure out how to tell your 8-year-old that the Saturday trip to the coast might have to wait another month. He squeezed her hand once, short and definite, like a handshake, and then he looked at Daniel Vaughn and extended his free hand and said, pleasantly, with the absolute unruffled calm of a man who has nothing to hide, "Nice to meet you, Daniel. I've heard a lot about you." Daniel's handshake was brief and hard, the grip of someone taking measurements. His eyes moved over Ethan with the practiced appraisal of a man who has been assessing the opposition his entire professional life. The clothes, the posture, the haircut, the absence of a luxury watch. "Have you now? Sophia talks about work constantly," Ethan said, with the easy familiarity of long practice. He glanced at her with the slightly exasperated warmth that long-term couples deploy. "Occupational hazard," Sophia said. Her voice had steadied. She leaned slightly into his shoulder, just slightly, just enough. Daniel stood very still. The calculation in his face was visible, the rapid recalibration of a man who had arrived expecting a certain kind of conversation and found the terrain had changed. "I wasn't aware you were seeing someone," he said, addressing Sophia as if Ethan weren't there. "You've been abroad for 3 months, Daniel. Things change." Another silence. Daniel's eyes moved to Ethan one more time, a final, searching look, and then he adjusted his coat collar with the deliberate composure of someone choosing their moment. "I'll be in touch," he said to Sophia. Not a farewell, a warning. He walked away. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Sophia released his hand and took a breath so careful it barely moved her shoulders, and said, very quietly, "Thank you." Ethan set his grocery basket down on the nearest surface and said, "Okay, who exactly is Daniel Vaughn?" He'd never been above the 3rd floor of the Bennett Holdings building. The elevator to the executive level required a key card, which, the receptionist, a young woman named Audrey, who looked like she'd been briefed that morning on the likely range of Ethan's reactions, and had decided to be professionally neutral about all of them provided. Without comment, the elevator itself was glass-walled on one side, overlooking the atrium, and Ethan stood in it the next morning in his best button-down shirt and watched the city tilt away below him and thought about all the ways this could go extremely wrong. Sophia's office was large, without being ostentatious: a long desk, a conference table, a wall of windows facing the Willamette River gray and silver in the November light. She was already there when he arrived, standing at the window with a coffee, still in her coat. She looked, he thought, exactly like someone who had been there since 6 in the morning working through what she was about to say. She said it without preamble. "Daniel isn't just my ex-husband. He holds 18% of the company's shares, which he acquired before we separated and which the settlement agreement allows him to retain. He's been building a case for the past 8 months that I'm not fit to lead this company. His argument to the board isn't operational. He's not questioning my numbers or my strategy. He's questioning my stability, my personal life. He believes the press profile of a 31-year-old divorced female CEO is a liability for the brand." Ethan sat in the chair across the conference table and said nothing. "Last night was the first time he's approached me in public, which means he's running out of patience. The board meeting is in 3 weeks. He's going to table a motion of no confidence. Marcus Chen and Patricia Rennick are the swing votes, not his allies, but not convinced by me either. If he can make the argument that I don't have a functioning personal life, that I'm unstable, they may go with him." "So, you need them to think you're stable," Ethan said. "I need them to see that I have a life outside this office, that I am a complete person and not the caricature Daniel has been constructing." A silence. "What you're describing is you asking me to continue pretending to be your boyfriend." For 3 weeks. In front of the board of a publicly traded company. At 2 events and 1 board dinner. You'd have a prepared background. I'd brief you thoroughly before each appearance. And in exchange, she put a folder on the table. Your position is secured regardless of any restructuring. You'd move to a day-shift logistics coordinator role. It pays $29.50. And there's a healthcare supplement for your daughter's pulmonologist appointments, formalized as a wellness stipend. Ethan looked at the folder. He didn't open it. "You know about Lily. I know about everyone who works for me." He sat with that for a moment. Then, "If this comes out, if anyone finds out this started in a supermarket with you asking a warehouse worker to pretend to be your boyfriend, it doesn't just hurt you, it ends your credibility entirely." "I know," she said. "So, you need me to commit to this completely. No half measures." "Yes." He looked at the river. He thought about the electric bill. He thought about Lily's face at breakfast that morning, still slightly pale from her cold, eating toast and reading a book about Persephone with the total absorption of someone who has not yet learned to worry about money. "I need to think about it until this afternoon," he said. "Of course." He stood. He picked up the folder. "One condition," he said at the door. "Name it. If at any point I think this is going to hurt my daughter in any way, I stop. No negotiation, no extension. I just stop." Sophia Bennett looked at him for a long moment. "Agreed," she said. The first event was a charity gala for a children's literacy foundation held at a hotel in the Pearl District on the kind of November evening where the city looked genuinely beautiful. Lights reflected in wet pavement, the bridges lit up over the river, the whole skyline doing its best impression of a postcard. Sophia's personal assistant, a precise and slightly formidable woman named Margaret, had arranged a car and a briefing packet and the loan of a suit from a men's outfitter on Burnside. The suit fit surprisingly well. Ethan stood in the hotel lobby wearing it and felt like an actor who has been handed a costume 10 minutes before the show opens. Margaret had spent 45 minutes with him the day before, running through the guest list. Marcus Chen, 62, commercial real estate background, political centrist, responds well to directness and poorly to what he calls atmospherics. Shake hands firmly, don't name drop, Don't over-explain. Patricia Rennick, 58, former CFO of a Pacific Northwest retail chain, reads people for a living. Will ask you a direct question at an unexpected moment and watch your face when you answer. Don't perform. Just answer. Gerald Harmon, 71, founding ERA board member, will spend most of the evening talking about his granddaughter's soccer team. Engage with this. It is not small talk. It is how he decides whether he likes you. Ethan read the briefing packet twice on the drive over. He set it on the seat and watched the city out the window and thought, I scan inventory for a living. I am 34 years old and I can recite every Greek god from memory because my daughter has been quizzing me for 6 weeks. What am I doing here? Then the car stopped. The door opened. Sophia was waiting on the steps in a deep green dress, and she held out her hand, and he took it, and they walked in. The first hour was navigation. He followed her lead, smiled when she smiled, stood close but not hovering, made space for her conversations without disappearing. He listened more than he spoke, which turned out to be exactly right at events like this. The person who listens is always more interesting than the person who talks. Marcus Chen found him at the bar at the 40-minute mark, and the conversation was shorter and more direct than the briefing had suggested it would be. What do you do, Ethan? Logistics coordination at Bennett Holdings. I'm in the middle of a role transition right now, moving from warehouse operations to supply chain analytics. How'd you meet Sophia? He had prepared this. He and Sophia had agreed on a version, friends of friends. A dinner party 6 months ago, slow start. But what he said instead was, by accident. In the right place, at the right time. Marcus Chen looked at him steadily. That's usually how it works, he said, and moved on. It was at the dinner portion of the evening, at a table of 8, when things shifted. Gerald Harmon was talking about his granddaughter, 9 years old, played center midfielder, had scored twice last Saturday in the rain, and been insufferably pleased with herself in the best possible way. Ethan, who had been listening with genuine attention, said, My daughter would love that. She's 8. She's not interested in sports, but she has exactly that energy. She read an entire mythology textbook last month and spent 3 days going through the house, explaining to me everything I'd been getting wrong about the Trojan War. The table laughed. Harmon pointed at him. What's her name? Lily. How long have you been raising her on your own? Ethan paused. Not from calculation. From the honest recalibration of someone who doesn't often say the next part out loud. 3 years, since she was 5. It's the thing I'm best at and the thing I know the least about, all at once. The table was quiet for a moment. Across the table, Sophia was looking at him. Not in the way she looked at clients or board members. Not with the measured, calibrated attention she deployed in professional settings. She was looking at him the way you look at something that has surprised you genuinely, without preparation. Under the table, her hand found his and she squeezed it once, lightly. It wasn't performance. He wasn't sure, later, when he turned it over in his mind on the drive home, whether she had even noticed she'd done it. He hadn't planned to tell Lily. He had planned, in fact, to maintain a strict separation. The arrangement was a professional obligation. It existed between 8 in the morning and whatever time the event ended, and it had no business entering the apartment on Clemens Avenue, or the bedtime routines, or any of the spaces where Lily lived her actual life. Then Lily, with the unerring precision of children, found the briefing packet. He came out of the shower on a Saturday morning to find her sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor with the folder open across her knees, reading Marcus Chen's bio with the same methodical focus she applied to mythology textbooks. He stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Lily, where did you find that?" She looked up. "Your jacket pocket. I was looking for the $5 you said I could have for the book fair." "Fair enough. Daddy, who is Sophia Bennett?" He sat down on the kitchen floor across from her. He thought about how to answer. He tried 3 versions in his head, and they all sounded either condescending or dishonest. and he had a rule about being honest with Lily. A rule he'd kept since Christine left, because the one thing he knew for certain was that children can sense dishonesty the way animals can sense weather. "She's the CEO of the company where I work," he said, "and she's in a complicated situation, and I'm helping her. Is she your friend?" "We're starting to be." "Is she your girlfriend?" A pause. "No, it's a professional arrangement, like a project." Lily considered this with the gravity of someone who has read about the Trojan War and knows how these things tend to end. "But you like her," she said. It wasn't a question. 2 weeks later, without quite knowing how it had happened, Ethan was standing in Washington Park on a Sunday afternoon with Lily on one side and Sophia on the other, watching a family of ducks do something inscrutable at the edge of the pond, while the November light came through the bare trees at an angle that made everything look like it was being filmed. He had not planned this. Sophia had called Saturday morning she had a free afternoon, she'd said, which sounded, from her slightly stilted delivery, like a thing she didn't often have and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. He had mentioned the park without thinking. She'd said she'd meet them there. Lily had been completely unselfconscious about it. She'd taken Sophia's hand about 10 minutes in, just reached over and taken it, the way she sometimes did with Ethan's friends, as if she were making an administrative decision about how things were going to be organized from here on. Sophia had gone very still for a moment, and then she'd looked down at Lily, and something had happened in her face, something that came and went quickly, some door opening and closing, and then she'd just walked alongside her, holding her hand, talking about the ducks. After a while, Lily stopped and looked up at Sophia with the directness that Ethan had long since stopped trying to moderate. "Daddy hasn't smiled this much in a long time," she said. "Like months." Sophia looked at Ethan. He was watching the ducks and trying very hard to look like someone who had not just had the back of his neck go warm. "He smiles all the time," he said. "Not like this," Lily said, with the serenity of someone stating a meteorological fact. Sophia said nothing, but she didn't let go of Lily's hand. Daniel Vaughn was not a man who accepted the evidence of his own eyes. He had built his professional career on the principle that what you see in a first encounter is almost never what is actually happening, that the surface of things is constructed precisely to mislead you, and that the correct response to any situation is to dig until you find the infrastructure beneath the appearance. This had made him very successful in commercial real estate and very difficult to be married to. He hired the investigator, a quiet, methodical man named Robert Fairfield, who operated out of an office in the Lloyd district and charged $300 a day plus expenses within 48 hours of the supermarket encounter. Fairfield's initial report was not reassuring. Ethan Carter was exactly what he appeared to be: a warehouse associate, a single father, no criminal history, no previous connection to Sophia Bennett or to any of her professional associates. But Daniel had been in enough negotiating rooms to know that when something appears exactly right, it is worth looking more carefully at the seams. He asked Fairfield to pull the Maple Street Market security footage. It took 4 days, a modest fee, and a cover story about a stolen vehicle. The store manager, a cooperative young man who clearly had no idea what he was handing over, provided the relevant timestamps without hesitation. Daniel watched the footage in his hotel room with a glass of bourbon and the particular focused attention he brought to things that mattered. He watched Sophia enter the market. He watched himself follow her. He watched the scene at Register 3, and then he watched, and this was the part he watched Sophia Bennett cross the store, reach a man she clearly had not been expecting to see, take his hand with her back to Daniel, and lean close to say something in his ear. The sequence was clear. She had approached him. She had spoken to him. And then there had been that brief, almost imperceptible pause, and then the man had turned and extended his hand to Daniel, and the whole scene had been different. She had recruited him, right there in the checkout lane, right there in front of his face. Daniel sat back in his chair and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, but something in between the flat, cold clarity of a man who has just confirmed exactly what he suspected and now knows exactly what move he's going to make. He picked up his phone and called Marcus Chen. "I have something you should see before the board dinner," he said. The Bennett Holdings Autumn Gala was the kind of event that existed in the intersection of business necessity and social performance. A fundraiser for a local housing nonprofit that served simultaneously as a showcase of the company's civic commitments and an informal arena where the board members and major shareholders circulated and took each other's temperature and made the small, oblique moves that preceded larger ones. Ethan had been to 3 events now. He understood the grammar of them. He arrived with Sophia in a car. He navigated the room with her. He stood near her but not behind her. He talked to people when they talked to him and listened when they wanted to be listened to and deflected when the question was about something he wasn't supposed to know. He had discovered, better at this than he'd expected, not because he was performing, but because he had stopped performing. Somewhere around the 3rd event, he had given up on trying to be what he thought these people expected and had simply started being himself in a different context. The complication arrived at 9:15. He was standing near the windows with Gerald Harmon, who was describing in considerable detail a particularly memorable penalty kick from his granddaughter's last tournament, when he felt a shift in the room's atmosphere, the specific pressure change of a scene assembling itself in the peripheral vision of everyone present. Daniel Vaughn had arrived, not on the original guest list, with Marcus Chen. Sophia was across the room with Patricia Rennick. Ethan saw the exact moment she clocked them, the slight adjustment of her posture, barely visible. A general's calculation of terrain. Daniel did not come to Sophia. He came to Ethan. This was the move, Ethan realized. Not to argue with Sophia, where she was formidable, but to destabilize the man beside her, the variable, the person who had everything to lose. Daniel stopped 2 feet away and said, pleasantly, "I've been doing some reading about you, Ethan. Remarkable thing, I couldn't find any record of you and Sophia in any context before last month. No mutual connections, no social circle in common. She's at charity boards and industry dinners, and you're, what was it, in the warehouse?" "That's right," Ethan said. "Interesting, the kind of gap that's usually bridged by something very specific." A few people nearby had gone quiet in the particular way that people go quiet at parties when a real conversation is happening in their proximity. "Sophia moved in some pretty elevated circles before you appeared. A lot of those people have known her for years. And none of them," Daniel said, "can place you." Ethan did not look away. He did not shift his weight. He had spent 3 years getting up at 2 in the afternoon after 4 hours of sleep to pick up a child from a school bus and make dinner and do the homework and read the mythology books and put her to bed and then drive to the warehouse and do it all again. And there was not a person in this room who could make him feel small with words, because he had already reckoned with every hard thing about his life and chosen it anyway. "People in elevated circles," he said quietly, "don't always show up when it matters. I have a different credential, which is," he looked at Daniel Vaughn steadily, "I know what loyalty looks like. I know what it costs. And I know the difference between a person who stands next to someone and a person who uses them." The room was silent. Daniel's expression didn't change. But something shifted in it, some fine crack in the composure. He turned and walked back to Marcus Chen. Patricia Rennick, who had materialized at Ethan's elbow at some point in the preceding 30 seconds, said, "Well, that was interesting." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Sorry, I don't know if that was the right." "It was fine," she said. And there was a note in her voice that he couldn't quite parse, something that might have been assessment, or might have been, almost, approval. The conference room on the executive floor had the dimensions of a room designed to make people feel the weight of the decisions made inside it. Long table, high ceiling, the city spread out behind the glass wall like a topographic argument for the importance of what happened here. Ethan was not in it. He was in the anteroom, a small space with a couch and a coffee machine, because the board meeting was not a place for him, would never have been a place for him, and he had understood this clearly from the beginning. His role in this story was not the boardroom. His role was the 33 days before the boardroom. Sophia had been in there for 40 minutes when Margaret came out of the elevator, crossed the anteroom without a word to him, and went through the conference room doors. He sat and listened to the rain against the windows. 12 minutes later, the doors opened and Margaret put her head out. "She'd like you inside." He went in. The board members were arrayed around the table, 7 faces in various degrees of composed attention. Daniel Vaughn was at the far end, beside a projection screen that showed, paused on its final frame, the security footage from Maple Street Market. The moment in the checkout lane. Clear as a photograph. Sophia was standing at the head of the table. She turned when Ethan entered, and something in her face said, "This is your choice, too." Daniel said, "I think everyone can see what this footage shows, Miss." Bennett approached this man, an employee, a warehouse associate in a supermarket, and recruited him, on the spot, to perform the role of her partner. What we've been watching for the past month is a performance, a managed fiction, designed to deceive this board. No one spoke for a moment. Then Sophia said, "He's right that it started in a supermarket. He's right that I asked Ethan to help me. That's the truth, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend otherwise." Someone at the table made a sound. Sophia continued, steadily, "But what this footage doesn't show, what Daniel doesn't want to discuss, is why I was in that supermarket in the first place. Why I needed help. Daniel has spent 8 months presenting to this board a portrait of me as an isolated, unstable person. He did this not because it's accurate, but because it serves his interests to replace me with someone more accommodating of his preferred strategy. A restructuring that benefits his portfolio at the cost of 400 jobs. She picked up a folder from the table. I have documentation. The private investigator hired to follow my personal schedule. The financial analysis showing what Daniel's proposed restructuring would cost in workforce terms versus what it would return to his specific share position. The communications between Daniel and 2 external parties, one of them a competing holdings company, about the valuation of Bennett Holdings assets in a post-restructuring scenario. She set the folder down. "I'm not asking you to approve of what I did in that supermarket. I'm asking you to look at what was done to me, and to ask yourselves whether the person in this room, who has been manufacturing a crisis for 8 months, methodically, at significant personal cost, is me." The silence was different now. Marcus Chen said, "I'd like to read that documentation before we vote on anything." "Of course," Sophia said. The vote, when it came an hour later, was 5-2. Sophia kept the chairmanship. The motion of no confidence failed. Daniel Vaughn was asked to recuse himself from further board participation pending an audit. In the anteroom, Ethan sat with his coffee gone cold and waited until the doors opened, and Sophia walked out still composed, still upright, but with something released in the line of her shoulders, some cable that had been under tension for a very long time, finally allowed to go slack. She stopped in front of him. "It's over," she said. "Good," he said. A pause. A breath. "The arrangement ends today," she said. "The role is yours regardless. The stipend is yours regardless." That was never contingent on the board meeting. "I know," he said. She nodded. She looked at the rain on the window. He picked up his jacket from the couch and put it on and said, at the door, "Lily wants to know if you're coming to the park again on Sunday." Sophia looked at him. "What did you tell her?" "That, I'd ask." Something moved through her expression, a whole conversation's worth of something, compressed into a moment. "I'll text you," she said. He nodded and went to the elevator. The arrangement, officially, was over. There were no more events on the calendar, no briefing packets, no car pickups at 7:15. Margaret had sent a final summary email, thorough and impersonal, confirming the terms, the role, the stipend, the healthcare supplement, all formalized through HR, without requiring further action on his part. Ethan went back to his schedule. Day shift now. 7 to 3:30, an adjustment so significant it felt, after 3 years of nights, like living in a different time zone. He walked Lily to the bus stop in the actual morning light and was home before dark and cooked dinner without the particular exhaustion of someone running on inverted hours. He slept through the night for the first time in months. He did not text Sophia. He didn't think about her in the way that constituted a problem, not obsessively, not with the specific ache of an unresolved thing. He thought about her the way you think about a door that is closed but not locked. The possibility of knocking on it was right there. He simply wasn't sure it was his knock to make. Lily, who had said nothing about Sophia since the park, asked on a Wednesday evening over spaghetti, "Is the project finished?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Will she still come to the park?" He looked at his daughter, who was twirling pasta with extreme concentration and pretending not to be waiting for the answer. "I don't know, Bug. That's up to her. You could ask?" "I could," he said. He didn't. That evening, he did the dishes and read 3 chapters of Lily's current book. They'd moved from mythology to an illustrated history of exploration, which was presenting him with interesting cartographic challenges, and put her to bed and sat in the kitchen afterward, with his phone on the table and a cup of tea going cold. He thought about the park. About Lily taking Sophia's hand without announcement or ceremony, the administrative decisiveness of an 8-year-old. About the way Sophia had looked at him at the gala, not the professional look, not the calculated one, but the real one, the one that had appeared first at the charity dinner, when he'd talked about being Lily's father, and he'd seen the door in her face open briefly, and hadn't said anything about it because it hadn't been the id moment. He thought, the arrangement is over. He thought, the arrangement was the excuse. He did not text her. On Friday evening, it rained again, the long, slow Pacific Northwest rain that settles in by November and doesn't really leave until April, the kind of rain that stops being weather and becomes simply the condition of the air. Lily was at her friend Maisie's house for a sleepover. The apartment was quiet in the way it only was on the rare evenings when she was somewhere else, a different quality of quiet, slightly too large for the space. Ethan was reading at the kitchen table when someone knocked at the door. He opened it. Sophia Bennett was standing in the hallway in jeans and a gray coat with rain on her shoulders and her hair slightly damp, holding a paper bag from the Thai place on Morrison that he'd mentioned once in passing, weeks ago, when she'd asked what his favorite restaurant was, and he'd laughed and said his budget ran more to the delivery version. No car. No calendar event. No briefing packet. No prepared background story. Just her. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Lily's at a sleepover," he said. "I know. She texted me," Sophia said. He stared. "You two have been texting. Since the park." "She wanted to know my favorite Greek god," I said, Artemis. He stepped back from the door. She came in. She set the paper bag on the kitchen table and shrugged out of the wet coat and looked at the apartment, the bookshelves where Lily's mythology textbooks lived alongside the exploration history and a small army of animal figurines she'd been collecting since she was 4, the drawings pinned to the refrigerator. The kitchen table with its one chair slightly pulled out from the rest where Lily always sat. "It looks like her," Sophia said. "The apartment. It looks exactly like a person lives here." "2 people," Ethan said. "Yes," she said, and there was something in her voice, something quiet and a little raw that made him look at her more carefully. She sat at the kitchen table. They opened the containers and the kitchen filled with steam and the smell of lemongrass, and they ate for a while without saying much, and the rain ran down the window in long, irregular lines, and the radiator clicked. Then Sophia said, "I want to say something and I'm not entirely sure how to say it." "You can just say it," Ethan said. "You're good at saying things directly. I've watched you do it." A brief, real smile. "The night at the charity dinner, when you talked about Lily," he was quiet. "I've been very careful, for a very long time, about not needing things. I got good at it after Daniel. I thought being CEO, being in control, being entirely self-sufficient, I thought that was what I was doing. Building something. And I think I was. But I also think it became a way of not being present to anything outside the building. She looked at her hands around the teacup. And then Lily took my hand and said you hadn't smiled like that in months, and I drove home and I sat in my apartment, which is very large and very clean and has absolutely no drawings on the refrigerator, and I thought about that for a long time. Ethan set his fork down. She looked at him. The last time we met in a supermarket, she said. Her voice was steady and direct and entirely unguarded in a way that cost her something he could see that it cost her. And he respected the cost. I'm not asking you to pretend this time. The radiator clicked. The rain moved down the window. Ethan reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same gesture she had made in the supermarket. The same grip. Short and definite and entirely certain. Good, he said. Because I'm not sure I know how anymore. She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded. The sound of someone who hasn't laughed that way in a while and is surprised, slightly, by the feeling of it. And outside, the November rain kept coming down over Portland, over the bridges and the wet streets and the lit windows of all the apartments where people were sitting across from each other in kitchens, working out the difficult and necessary arithmetic of what happens when you decide, deliberately, and with full understanding of the cost, to stop pretending. Lily came home the next morning to find Sophia at the kitchen table with a coffee, reading the exploration history book, having apparently encountered a cartographic inaccuracy on page 47 that she felt strongly about. Lily sat down across from her and said, without preamble, I knew it. Did you? Sophia said. Artemis, Lily said, with deep satisfaction. She's the independent one. And then she makes an exception. Sophia looked at her over the book. Your daughter, Ethan called from the kitchen, has been reading too much mythology. Lily and Sophia looked at each other and said, simultaneously, there's no such thing as too much mythology. Nobody was pretending. That was the whole of it. That was the thing that was different now, and that would stay different. And that had started as the most consequential things do, not in a boardroom or a press profile or